Good afternoon, and welcome to this year's Governor Frank Leach Lecture and our timely conversation on threats to democracy with Congressman Adam Schiff. I'm Susan Moffett. I'm the director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy here at Brown University. Welcome all. We are deeply grateful to the Leach family, whose generous support has made today's lecture possible. This lecture series is in honor of Frank Leach, a graduate of Brown University, class valedictorian, later trustee of the university, who went on to serve 2 terms as Rhode Island's governor from 1969 through 1973. He was also a distinguished jurist, for whom Rhode Island's Frank Leach Judicial Complex is named. Governor Leach was a gutsy fighter who rarely withheld from expressing his convictions. And it's for this reason a lecture series in which public leaders could speak freely about important issues of the day was established in his honor. We are delighted today to be joined by former First Lady Dorothy Leach and many members of the Leach family. Will you please join me in very warmly welcoming and thanking the Leach family? And we are honored that here to speak with us freely about important issues of the day is Congressman Adam Schiff. As you know, this year, the Taubman Center is focusing its programming on 3 themes: the cost of living, the value of democracy, and the price of security. Congressman Schiff's work and experience speaks to all of these themes and the ways that they intersect. Congressman Schiff has represented California's 28th district in Congress since 2001, and he is currently the ranking member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence that oversees the nation's intelligence agencies. A leader on national security, foreign policy, and human rights, Congressman Schiff authored the Nuclear Forensics and Attribution Act to address nuclear proliferation. Congressman Schiff also co-founded the Congressional Caucus for Freedom of the Press, which is a bipartisan, bicameral caucus that aims to advance press freedoms around the world. Congressman Schiff's expertise extends to his work on economic development, safety, healthcare, and education. Before serving in the U.S. Congress, he was a state senator in California, where, among his many accomplishments, he led legislative efforts to guarantee up-to-date textbooks in California classrooms, overhaul child support, and pass a Patient's Bill of Rights. In the spirit of the lecture series established in the honor of Frank Leach, where public leaders speak freely about issues of the day, we're honored to have Congressman Schiff here with us, and we're honored to have moderating our conversation Dr. Nina Tannenwald. Dr. Tannenwald is a faculty fellow at the Watson Institute for Public Affairs and a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Science and director of Brown University's International Relations Program. She is an expert on global security issues, efforts to control weapons of mass destruction, human rights, and laws of war. Among her many publications include her prize-winning book, The Nuclear Taboo: The United States and the Non-Use of Nuclear Weapons Since 1945. So our time together will unfold in the following way. Congressman Schiff will begin with about 30 minutes of comments on threats to democracy. We'll then follow with 15 minutes of conversation with Dr. Tannenwald, and then we'll open up the floor to your questions. We're very eager to hear your questions. You may line up at the microphones, and we will take your questions in turn. We are a full house this afternoon, which is great, but that invites us all to be mindful of our airtime, including me. So when it is your time to ask your question, I would invite you to ask one direct question and then share the air with your colleagues. Now, will you please join me in very warmly welcoming Congressman Schiff.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. What a treat to be here at Brown. I've been so looking forward to this. Mrs. Leach and Leach family, I want to thank you for making this possible. And Dean, really so delighted to be here and have a chance to talk with students and faculty and community members about what's going on. Really not much happening. So it'll be a brief conversation. Really nothing new at all. I think that's pretty much it. I thought I would start out today, and I'll try to keep my remarks briefer than the 30 minutes so that we can have more time for question and answer. But I thought I would start out, and not surprisingly, give you a few thoughts on the Russia investigation. What does this mean anyway? Why should people care about this? Is this, as the president likes to say, simply a witch hunt or a hoax or the Democrats' excuse for losing an election? What does this really matter anyway? Isn't this old news? And I think obviously there are a number of competing narratives about how we ought to interpret the Russian involvement in our election. From the president's point of view, this is all a charade. We're not even sure whether the Russians did it. In fact, the president, in his first meeting with Putin, apparently asked Putin whether he did it. And he came back and our president assured us that Putin had said no, he hadn't done it. And lest we be somehow skeptical that a former KGB operative would give us an honest answer, the president assured us that he not only asked Putin, he asked him twice. So there's that. But even among Democrats, there's a tendency, I think, to think too narrowly about what this means. Why did the Russians get involved? Why did they get involved in such a substantial way? It's certainly the case, as many Democrats maintain, that the Russians had a preferred candidate in Donald Trump, and there was every reason for them to prefer Donald Trump. Here was someone, after all, who spoke disparagingly of NATO, someone who was willing to entertain doing away with sanctions over Russia's invasion of its neighbor, and who among us would have thought we would see in this century a nation in Europe remake the map by dint of military force? But that's what Russia did, and nonetheless, candidate Trump talked about potentially doing away with sanctions on Russia over its violation of the Ukraine. Then there was the president's then candidate's support for Brexit and further dissolution of Europe, a very high priority for the Russians. And the president's willingness to make common cause with the Russians in Syria. Now today, that doesn't look like such a good idea. But at the time, he was talking about working together with Russia under the mistaken impression that the Russians were in Syria to fight the terrorists. In fact, they were there to fight the moderate opposition and to prop up Bashar al-Assad. But they had every reason to prefer Donald Trump. Conversely, they had every reason to despise Hillary Clinton and to be determined that she not become the President of the United States. During the 2011 parliamentary elections in Russia, Hillary Clinton spoke out, as we would hope our Secretary of State would, and condemned fraud in those elections and talked about the right of people everywhere to be able to choose their representatives. And this, Putin felt, was a direct affront to his regime, and more than that, a threat to his regime. Putin looked at these color revolutions that were going on around the world and saw in them the hidden hand of the CIA, the hidden hand of the State Department. Not only the color revolutions, which came perilously close to home when the Orange Revolution came to Ukraine, but also the Arab Spring itself, the Russians and Putin view as somehow the CIA's handiwork. When I meet with the CIA, which as the ranking member on Intel is quite often, I will compliment them on their omnipotence, because apparently the CIA has done everything in the world, although of course not all of that has turned out so well. But this is the Russian view, that the Americans, through their CIA, through their other intelligence agencies, through their State Department, have been fomenting revolutions to displace autocratic rulers, and this was a direct threat to Putin. Because Putin doesn't fear losing an election. If you're a viable opponent of the Kremlin, you're either forced out of the race, as his last opponent was, and here, of course, you have the irony of our president calling to congratulate Putin, notwithstanding the do not congratulate, for having won an election in which his main rival was prohibited from running. Not much of an achievement from my point of view, but nonetheless, you either end up marginalized, prohibited from running, or you end up in jail or dead. He's not going to lose a democratic election. But what he does fear, what he has feared, is the power of people to gather in massive numbers and displace even their autocratic rulers. And indeed, I think probably one of the driving reasons for the Russians to get involved in Syria had less to do with their interest in maintaining a base in Syria or to reinsert themselves within the Middle East, but rather to fight the idea that you could topple an autocratic ruler, as these color revolutions were claiming victim after victim. So Putin had every reason to prefer Trump and to strongly disfavor Hillary Clinton. But far more fundamental, what the Russians were after is tearing at the very fabric of our democracy, undermining and sowing discord in our civic union. And what the Russians were doing here, we see so well illustrated in their social media campaign. And one of the things that leapt out at me of this last indictment that was returned by Bob Mueller is the extraordinary level of detail that indictment shows about how the Russians use social media not only to try to persuade people online, but also to give Americans the impression that these were indigenous neighbors of theirs. The Heart of Texas webpage came to us from St. Petersburg, had more followers than the Texas Republican Party. But these phony pages and phony persona actually mobilized real Americans to dress up in a prison outfit and put on a wig and pretend to be Hillary Clinton and get into a cage. Real Americans were prompted to take action on the basis of these fake personas that the Russians used. That indictment goes chapter and verse into how they were using social media to divide us. Now, social media was just one of the vectors that they used. There were others, including the hacking of democratic institutions, the dumping of documents, the use of their paid media. If you look at RT, for example, the Russian television, they were pushing out stories about the election, and not stories that were sort of neutral, objective journalism, or even stories that were evenly divided in their critiques of the candidates. No, they were stories like the 4 times the Clintons almost got indicted, or Hillary Clinton's failing health. They were using their paid media also to amplify discord in the United States, yes, but also amplify messages of the Trump campaign. But what they really wanted to do was just undermine our democracy, to pit Americans against other Americans. So they looked at the divisions in our society, divisions over race and divisions over immigration, divisions over LGBT rights, and they sought to widen the gulf, to turn us against each other. And what they did here was novel to us, but it is not novel to the rest of the world. The Russians have been using these tactics in Europe and the Balkans and elsewhere. What was new was that they decided to do this in the strongest democracy on earth and to an unprecedented degree. It's not the first time the Russians have interfered here, but nothing of this scope and scale. Now, there's a lot of speculation about why the Russians decided now that they would embark on this, and we get some insights from some of the key dates that you see in that Mueller indictment of when the Internet Research Agency was gearing up its work. And some have speculated that our support for the right of representation in Ukraine was a mile too far for the Russians. But for whatever reason, whatever the casus belli was for the Russians, they got involved here far more substantially than they had in the past. But they've been doing this elsewhere. This is part of an effort to undermine the very idea of liberal democracy. And it comes at a time when we, I think, must recognize that autocrats around the world are on the rise. We saw this just recently in the election in Hungary, in which Orban may now have a two-thirds majority in the parliament. But we saw it in the growth of Marine Le Pen's party in France. She didn't win, but she nonetheless got a greater share of the vote. We see it in the rise of far-right parties in Germany and in Austria. We see it in autocrats in the Philippines like Duterte, in Erdogan, in Turkey, al-Sisi in Egypt. Turkey is now the leading jailer of journalists in the world. It is moving strongly and swiftly in the autocratic direction. The autocrats are on the rise. The very idea of liberal democracy is at risk. And this is, I think, the significance of what Russia did. It wasn't just about one election. It wasn't just about helping one candidate or hurting the other. It takes place during a time in which autocracy is winning adherents around the world. I think we have all lived our lives in a world that was ever increasing in its freedoms, with more people living with democratic governance and more people with a free press and more people able to worship as they would or love whom they would. And we thought that this was somehow an immutable law of nature, only to find out that it is not. We thought, to paraphrase Martin Luther King, that the moral arc of the universe was long, but it was bending towards justice, only to find out that right now it is not bending towards justice. And increasingly, when people around the world look to us as that beacon of democracy, they don't recognize what they see. And the reality is there's nowhere else to turn. You know, for the people in Tahrir Square who gathered in the hopes of being able to pick their own leader, many of them thrown in jail, others still at risk of being thrown in jail, they look to us. And the people in the Philippines who have been the victims of this campaign of mass extrajudicial killing, they look to us. And the journalists in Turkey from their jail cells, they look to us. But increasingly, they don't recognize what they see. What they see instead in our administration is a fondness for autocrats, someone who has great difficulty criticizing authoritarians, someone who models their interactions with the press. You see now dictators around the world making use of the term fake news to disparage what little free press they have left. I started a caucus in the Congress on freedom of the press about 15 years ago. My co-chair was a bipartisan, bicameral caucus, was Mike Pence. And our focus was on freedom of the press issues outside the country, but now we have to focus on freedom of the press issues inside our country, where the very idea of objective fact is under assault. I made an observation a few months ago that I thought was completely unremarkable because it seemed so self-apparent, and I was surprised when it got a reaction, but I made the observation that the threat from without, the threat to our democracy from Russia and elsewhere, is now less than the threat from within. In what we see of the undermining of our institutions, our system of checks and balances, we have probably the greatest challenge to our democracy, certainly in my lifetime, when the president denigrates the press and belittles the idea that there's an objective reality. That does serious, long-lasting damage to our democracy. When the White House breaks down the wall of independence between the White House and the Justice Department, that is seriously undermining our democracy. We put in place protections after Watergate to prevent interference with the Justice Department, especially in cases in which the White House has an interest. You can look at the firing of Andy McCabe, and sometimes there are certain acts that in microcosm tell you all you need to know about where our country is. I'll give you two: the firing of Andy McCabe and the pardoning of Joe Arpaio. You could look at those two acts and see everything we need to be concerned about with our democracy. Joe Arpaio was a law enforcement officer violating the law and the Constitution by racially profiling people. Now, he had been brought up and convicted, but he had not even been sentenced yet when the President of the United States announced that he was going to pardon him at a political rally. Now, normally, the way the pardon process is supposed to work, someone is convicted, they are sentenced, they are serving their time, maybe they've served a lot of their sentence, they've made restitution, they've shown repentance. There is a usually multi-year process of evaluation within the Justice Department and recommendations to the President. Not this time. This was a pardon announced at a political rally for someone who showed no repentance, made no restitution. Indeed, the case wasn't even over yet. And that was part of the purpose. Because as much as it was about Joseph Arpaio, it was also about Paul Manafort and Mike Flynn and sending a message that if you stick with me like Arpaio, I'll have your back. I won't even wait until the criminal case is over. You can see in that one act, in that brazen interference with the justice system, with a sworn law enforcement officer violating the law, all that we need to be worried about. But also with Andy McCabe. Now, the Inspector General has been doing an investigation for some time of the handling of the Clinton email investigation. And there's a lot to criticize and critique about how that was handled. But that investigation isn't over. Instead, one piece of it was accelerated. And that was the piece involving Andrew McCabe. That was accelerated. There was a finding by the Inspector General, evidently of wrongdoing, and he was fired before he could receive his pension. Now, why was that one piece of a broad investigation taken away from the rest and accelerated? I have never seen that happen before. It was done because the President of the United States was badgering the Justice Department to fire Andy McCabe before his pension. And the Justice Department buckled. Now, we may find when the Inspector General issues his report that the criticisms of Andy McCabe were justified, and maybe even his firing was justified. But what was not justified, what taints the entire investigation, is the fact that the President of the United States was badgering the Justice Department to take action against an individual, and it worked. And not just against any individual, and not just an action by any individual. It was an action of firing by Jeff Sessions, someone who had committed to recusing himself from any action, including on this one. But more than that, Andy McCabe was one of several witnesses that have been targeted by the President of the United States, including James Comey's Chief of Staff and James Comey's General Counsel, who corroborate James Comey on the issue of obstruction of justice. So the President is taking aim at those who corroborate a case potentially against himself. In these ways and so many others, in which we see a Justice Department badgered into opening an investigation of the President's vanquished political rival over a 7-year-old uranium transaction. In these ways and so many others, we see every day a little bit more of our system of checks and balances, a little bit more of the heart and soul of our democracy being whittled away. And this is, I think, the challenge, to reassert a system of checks and balances, to defend our institutions. For me, the most terrible surprise of the past year has not been what kind of President Donald Trump would turn out to be. I think that was all too predictable. The terrible surprise has been how mute the Congress would be in the face of that, how few people would be willing to stand up to speak out, to defend our institutions. We have a President of the United States who talks about withdrawing the license of NBC because he doesn't like their coverage. We have a system in which a merger involving the parent of CNN may not go through because the President doesn't like CNN's coverage. But acquisitions by Sinclair Broadcasting will be green-lighted because he does like their coverage. This is not our democracy. At least it shouldn't be. And so I think this is one of the preeminent challenges we have, both foreign, yes, but domestic as well. And as long as the occupant at 1600 Pennsylvania is not advocating for democracy, is not the champion of democracy, it falls on all the rest of us to step into that void, to defend our system of checks and balances, to insist on an independent judiciary, an independent Justice Department, on a free press. And this, I think, is what's really at stake right now, which is far broader than Russia, far broader even than the rise of these autocrats, but the diminution of our own democracy. This is, I think, the preeminent challenge we face right now, and I appreciate the opportunity to come and address it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Congressman Schiff. I'm Nina Tannenwald, and it's a pleasure to see you here in person as opposed to in my kitchen on TV on Sunday mornings. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk with you. So I'm going to ask maybe 2 or 3 questions here, and then we'll open it up for general discussion. My job here is perhaps to ask some hard questions. So let me start with one about the larger context of the Russian investigation. So, as someone who oversees the CIA and presumably knows quite a bit about the history of the CIA, what do you say to the charge that the US has interfered in elections in other countries around the world, especially during the Cold War in Latin America, in the Middle East? How do we place the Russian interference in the United States, US elections, in the context of that broader charge about US past behavior in other countries?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think those critiques of our policy in the past have far too much merit for us to ignore. We certainly have done unsavory things in the past, and I think we need to own up to our involvement in the deposing of figures that were antithetical to us or believed to be at the time. Our conduct in Iran many years ago, I think, led tragically to that theocratic dictatorship that the people of Iran are forced to suffer now. But I would hope that we would put those times in the past. I would hope that we would live up to our aspirations and our ideals. And I had every confidence in the last administration that we were doing so, that we were supporting democracies, that we were championing democracies, that we were not seeking to engage in the kind of subterfuge that the Russians were. If we do, then we lose any kind of moral standing to be the champions of democracy. So yes, we have a blemished past, and I think the only thing we can do is own up to it, but also be that voice for people around the world who crave a chance to pick their representatives, to live in a society that is not corrupt, to have a press that's meaningful, that can shed sunlight on corruption within their own governments and regimes. That really ought to be our role. It's, I think, very important contribution that we can make that no one else can. And I know the idea of America as the indispensable nation has been given a bad name, But we really are indispensable in the sense that there is no other nation that can do what we can. Folks around the world right now that are looking to us, they're obviously not going to look to Russia, they can't look to China, and they can't look to Europe with all of the problems within Europe these days. There is simply no other nation that is positioned to be, I think, as great a force for good, and particularly when it comes to the promotion of democracy. So we need to own up to our past, but we need to be the proud champion of democracy and liberty in the future.
All right, let me take up the question of a constitutional crisis. So, as we read the news every day, I'm becoming more and more worried about the potential for a constitutional crisis. For example, if Trump refuses a judicial order. And I wonder how worried you are about this. As I look to the future, the potential for a case that might lead to impeachment, it worries me because it seems like if impeachment goes forward and that the polarization of the country is increased and not diminished. And no matter how much we may find Trump problematic, that in the end, for the long-term future of the country, in terms of the partisanship, it would be better if he were removed from office electorally rather than through an impeachment process. And so we don't know what Mueller is going to come out with, what he's going to find, but I guess one question is what would the level of Trump's involvement have to be in order for you to feel like there was a basis for an impeachment process that would outweigh the political cost to the unity of the country of holding that kind of impeachment process?
Yeah. Well, I have a unique experience to bring to bear on this. I tried an impeachment case in the Senate about 8 or 10 years ago. I was on the House Judiciary Committee, and we impeached a New Orleans federal judge on corruption charges. Now I know what you're thinking, New Orleans corruption, that's impossible. But he took us to trial, and we went to trial in the Senate. I was asked to help lead the prosecution in the Senate. And, one of the things that it taught me was, because there aren't many of these throughout history to serve as a guide, there's a certain legal standard in terms of what constitutes a high crime or a misdemeanor. But more importantly, there's a practical political standard. And the practical political standard in today's environment is, can members, particularly from conservative districts, Republican districts or conservative Democratic districts, go back home and make the argument that the president's conduct was so incompatible with office that they had to vote to remove them, and it wasn't simply about nullifying an election that those other people didn't like. If they can't make that argument, there is no impeachment, no matter how high the crime or serious the misdemeanor. And that's a very high bar. It's a very high bar. Now, I'm deeply concerned that the president may fire Mueller, and more concerned about it today than I was really at any time in the past. We know already that, at least there are credible reports, the president already tried to fire him once, and his hand was stayed when the White House counsel McGahn refused to carry out the order. But we also know that he has pushed out of his legal team Dowd, one of the lawyers who was arguing for a more cooperative relationship with the special counsel, that he tried to bring in another lawyer named DeGeneva. Now, DeGeneva auditioned to be one of the president's lawyers the way everyone auditions for a part in the Trump administration, by going on Fox. Apparently, the entire universe of qualified people are Fox commentators. This particular Fox commentator was on Fox saying that there was a conspiracy within the FBI to frame the President of the United States. So this is who the President wanted as his lawyer. Now, evidently he has some conflict, so it looks like he didn't take the job. But that's who the President wants, a pugilist who goes on Fox to say the FBI is conspiring against him. Moreover, we've seen in the last few weeks a willingness now by the President to directly attack Mueller on Twitter. This is how the President tests the waters. And what I fear is the case is the President has made a calculus that if Bob Mueller gets too close And in particular, Bob Mueller does what I learned to do as a prosecutor, and that is follow the money. If Bob Mueller follows the money, if he investigates whether the Trump organization was laundering money for the Russians, that he's better off taking whatever blowback he gets from firing Mueller than actually Mueller doing his job. That concerns me deeply, and it concerns me in significant part because the people who should be speaking out right now about this are being mute, and that is members of Congress, particularly in the House. I keep telling my colleagues, don't wait until we have a constitutional crisis. The president needs to hear you now. Go out on Fox the way he listens to people and tell the president that this would be a constitutional crisis that could bring down his administration. We're better off avoiding the crisis than waiting until it comes. But you hear very little out of the House. In fact, what you see out of the House is the Republicans on my committee saying, we're done investigating Russia, and we're done investigating what the Trump campaign may have done in coordination with the Russians. Now, on our part, we're continuing to do the investigation without them. But the Republicans in the House, and the only authorized investigation in the House, have said, we're not interested anymore. So what position are they to complain if the president says, well, the House Republicans decided they'd done their investigation and saw no evidence of collusion, so how can they object to my firing Bob Mueller and putting an end to this investigation? So I agree with you that it would be enormously jarring to the country to go through an impeachment of another president. This is not something the country should race towards. And indeed, when my colleagues in the House ask me to give them an update on the Russia investigation, I give them an update. But I also tell them not to be talking about impeachment. The investigation isn't even over. Indeed, we continue to learn more every day. And we ought to let the investigation run its course and see what evidence is produced, and then decide what is the consequence of what we have found. Because for one thing, if we ultimately did have to make the case to those people out in the country that the president's conduct was so incompatible with office that he had to be removed, it'll be that much more difficult if it appears to them this is what we wanted from the very beginning. So I don't think it's wise for my colleagues or others to be out airing commercials or doing whatever, pushing the idea of impeachment. Rather, we ought to be pushing the idea of a system of checks and balances in which a special counsel is allowed to do his job, that he is beyond the reach of the President of the United States, who has the deepest conflict of interest in terms of what the special counsel is doing, and that's really what I've been urging.
I'll ask one more question, and then we'll open it to the floor. What do you think the U.S. response to the use of chemical weapons in Syria should be?
Well, this is enormously hard decision for the president, and obviously it was an enormously difficult decision for Barack Obama. Indeed, I think the deepest stain on the last administration will be the terrible war in Syria and the enormous loss of life. Now, there were never any good options in Syria, which makes it hard to be too much of a critic, because other approaches than the one the Obama administration took may have ended up in an even worse place. It's very difficult to game that out. But the current president now is in the position of having criticized his predecessor for drawing a red line and not enforcing it. And he's drawn his own red line. Indeed, drew a red line a year ago, the last time that he ordered missiles to be fired into Syria for a chemical weapons attack. Now, there have been other chemical weapons attacks since then, but the president has said that the Assad regime is going to pay a heavy price. Just wait. So we're waiting to see what the president does. Now, this most recent chemical weapons attack takes place within days of the President of the United States saying he wants our troops out of Syria. This from a president that said of Obama that it was a terrible, stupid mistake for him to telegraph when he was going to pull troops out of Iraq or Afghanistan. Was the regime listening when the president said that? Did the regime believe that it could continue this, not only chemical weapons, but other war crimes against civilians with impunity because the president just wanted out. We'll never know what contribution those comments may have made to this most recent attack. But I think the president is committed to taking military action of some kind. What I'd like to see the Congress do, and this is something I've been urging even before the war began in Syria, but the importance of it has only accelerated since, and that is we need to have a debate on our wars in Congress and a vote on our wars. We passed authorizations to use force in 2001 and 2002. The first to authorize a force against those in al-Qaeda, those responsible for 9/11, and the second to authorize force against Saddam Hussein. Neither of those apply in Syria. Neither of those apply to the war against ISIS as a whole. ISIS didn't even exist at the time of 9/11, and indeed ISIS, through much of its existence, has been fighting with al-Qaeda, not a franchise of al-Qaeda. But Congress completely sidelined itself. We have allowed our power to declare war or not declare war, the role that we play in terms of a check on the executive war-making authority to completely atrophy. I've introduced resolution after resolution to repeal these prior authorizations and replace them with something that was more narrowly tailored and sunset, so we wouldn't have unending wars without accountability. That's, I think, Congress's obligation at the moment, which is to insist on reasserting itself in the war-making process to either authorize or fail to authorize the use of force in places like Syria, in Somalia, in Yemen, or anywhere else. But I would fully imagine there will be another limited strike ordered by the president, less limited than the one that came before. But I don't have much expectation that that is going to change the trajectory in Syria any more than the last strike did. And the final thing I'll say is I think it would be a grave mistake for us to precipitously pull out our troops from Syria the way the president has suggested. We have already pulled the rug out from the Kurds before. The Kurds were among the very best fighters in terms of working with us to defeat ISIS, which did pose a threat to us and does pose a threat to us. I think we have a moral obligation to the Kurdish people. What's more, I think if we do precipitously withdraw, we could see another rise of ISIS or something like it, or see the Kurds massacred by the Turks. Either way, I think would be inimical to our security, but also to our reputation. And this is something that the Russians are frankly already espousing, and that is we stay, we remain committed, and the Americans are going to run. And to those in the region, just know the Russians will stick with you through thick and thin, and the Americans are fair weather friends, just ask the Kurds. So there is a very serious reputational cost, as well as a cost to our security if the president follows through with his threat to precipitously withdraw our forces there.
Thank you, Congressman. The floor is now open for questions, so I invite you to come up to the microphones here, and please try to make your questions brief and to the point. We'll start right here.
Thank you for your time.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
Yes, Lita Wars, I'm an undergrad student here. I'm also a veteran, and my last station was with the United States Cyber Command. And as you're probably familiar with, coming from your position, the term Cyber 9/11 gets thrown around a lot in this cyber debate and also in foreign policy. And what I haven't seen is connecting the dots between what has happened in 2016 and the propaganda in connection to what could be considered the Cyber 9/11 type event. And what my question is, related to this, we've seen that our cyber capacity has greatly diminished over the past 10, 20 years, especially comparative to our adversaries' gains. Do you perceive that Cyber Command needs to become its own branch of the U.S. Armed Forces, or do you see the next evolution from your perspective?
You know, I have favored elevating the Cyber Command as well as dividing the function of the head of the the head of the NSA as a way of emphasizing the importance of developing our cyber capabilities and our cyber defensive capabilities, So I think the Cyber Command should be separate and its role and responsibility elevated. I would disagree only in the sense that I don't think it's so much that our cyber capabilities have atrophied. We still have, I think, the most potent cyber capability of any nation on earth. But this is a battlefield in which our adversaries are gaining a lot of ground and which is completely asymmetrical, and the advantage really lies with those on offense. On defense, you need to protect every door, every window, every entry point. On offense, you just need to find one unlocked door. And it's not necessarily in our advantage to get in a cyber tit-for-tat, even with countries that have a far less cyber capability. Just to give you one illustration, when the North Koreans hacked Sony, you might remember, over the film The Interview, not even a particularly good movie. I mean, if you're going to attack us, at least attack us over a good movie. I represent Hollywood, so I take this very personally. But we really had little or no response to that attack. What I was urging at the time was not necessarily that that cyber attack should have a cyber response. The North Koreans' capabilities in the cyber world are not insignificant, but they're nothing compared to ours. The problem is we're also far more exposed than they are. You might remember that the lights were going out in Pyongyang around this time, and people were speculating, was that our response? Were we sending a message by turning out their lights? The problem is the lights are always going out in Pyongyang. And if that was our response, then at least your adversary needs to know it, if it's going to have any kind of a deterrent effect. What I was urging at the time, because we do lack a deterrent, and that's one of the big problems, what I was urging at the time was not that we have a cyber response and then the North Koreans escalate in a way that makes us even more vulnerable, but that we respond often the way South Koreans respond that really gets the North's attention, and that is we respond with information. We respond by getting information to the North Korean people through a variety of means about what a terrible regime they live under that's starving them to support a nuclear program they can't afford, a regime that's living lavishly and corruptly. Now that would make Kim Jong-un think twice about a cyber attack on an American business again. That would have been, I think, a deterrent. But because we did little or nothing, we announced some new sanctions that on a nation that's already among the most sanctioned in the world had little or no impact. I think the North Koreans took away from that, well, it's a freebie. But I think the Russians were watching too and realized that they could engage in their own cyber attacks and not expect much of a response. After one of the advantages of cyber warfare is there's always a level of deniability. Even in the case of the North Korean hack, I remember some of the cyber pundits out there were saying, show us the proof. And of course, with the Russian interference in our election, Putin was saying, show us the proof. They would love for us to show them the proof. Then it becomes that much easier to hide their hand the next time. We're never going to want to show, in every respect, how we know who is attacking us in the cyber realm. But that's not an excuse to fail to take action. And one of the criticisms I have of the Obama administration handling the Russian hack is I was urging them in real time to call out the Russians on what they were doing while it was happening. And for quite some time, we couldn't get them to do it. And I was urging that they begin discussions on sanctions then, not wait until after the election. And I'll tell you what I was worried about. What I was most worried about did not happen. But there's no guarantee it won't happen in the midterms. And that is, for the most part, the documents that the Russians hacked and dumped were authentic, in the sense that they didn't dump forgeries. But you could imagine how devastating it would be if 3 weeks before a presidential election, amidst the dump of authentic documents, the Russians were to dump forgeries. Or even more pernicious, take a real document, a real email, that's 2 paragraphs long and add a 3rd paragraph that suggests illegality. Let's say they dumped a document that suggested that Hillary Clinton had been engaged in some illegality. There would be no way to disprove that during a contested election, and certainly not if they dumped it close to the election. So what do you do about that? Number one, you have to have a deterrent. Number two, you have to develop a consensus that when you do identify foreign interference in our elections, both parties repudiate it. That it's a disadvantage to whatever side the foreign party was trying to intervene. We didn't have that in the last election. I'm continually struck in this job by the fortuity of events in the world. One of the terrible fortuities of 2016 was in the same year the Russians decided to become that much more engaged in our affairs, to become that less risk-averse and intervene. We had a candidate who was willing to welcome that intervention, who was willing to say, hey, Russians, if you're listening, hack Hillary Clinton's emails. I'm convinced had John McCain or Mitt Romney been the nominee in 2016, they would have said, Russians, butt the hell out. We don't want your help. We despise your intervention. We want nothing to do with you. But we didn't have that, and we darn well better have that for the next election. That's probably the best thing, the single most important thing we can do. And we're going to try to harden our defenses. But if the Russians want to get into the DNC again, they're going to be able to get in. If they want to get into the Republican National Campaign Headquarters next time because they've got an axe to grind with Republicans, they'll get in there too. They're sophisticated enough, and it just isn't that hard, even with the best defense. The most important thing for us to do is develop a national consensus that we will reject it. And what's preventing us from getting there is a president who doesn't even acknowledge that it happened in the first place. But I think you're right that this is just one element of cyber defense, but imagine the risk of the warfighter not knowing whether the data they're getting is real or corrupt. That's a terrifying prospect. And so there are enough aspects of this new battle space that it really deserves its own command. It deserves its own priorities. It deserves, in my view, separate leadership from the NSA overall.
Thank you very much for your time, sir.
Hello, Professor. I'm Jerome Saines, Professor of Neuroscience here at Brown. Thank you very much for your hard work in Congress and particularly in the Select Committee on Intelligence. And I'd like to think that the prolonged applause you received is a reflection of our gratitude. My question relates to the observation that you made of many of your colleagues, particularly Republicans, have not been outspoken in support of what I believe you've correctly identified as democratic values that we all share. Do you think that this might have to do that they want political advantage or that they're afraid of getting reelected?
Well, I think, honestly, I think it's political cowardice. I was marveling to John McCain some time ago, why isn't there a single Republican in the House of Representatives that feels they have a constituency to be the John McCain of the House? Why is that? I would think that would be a good place for any number of GOP members to be. But you don't see a single GOP member in the House speak out. Now, part of it is, you could explain, I guess, in the most rudimentary way. If you're a Republican from a very conservative district, then you have to be concerned that if you alienate the Trump supporters in your district, that they will run a primary challenge against you. And in a GOP primary, you'll lose. If you're a Republican from a swing district and you alienate the 30% of your district that are Trump supporters, and you can't win over the Democrats because you've already alienated the Democrats on the tax bill and health care and everything else, then you're a man or a woman without a country, and you're at risk of losing your seat. So at the most basic level, you can see the political calculus. But from my point of view, that's just the political calculus. What about the country? What about the Constitution? What about our democracy? I don't understand, to give you an illustration of the timidity at the center is the speaker. Why be speaker? Why go through all the work to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives if you're not going to stand up for the institutions of our country when it really matters? Now, I think the Speaker could stand up and still remain Speaker, and I think a great many Republican members could stand up and speak out and retain their seats and their dignity. But few have. I came to Congress with Jeff Flake, and I want to tell you, I have great respect for Jeff Flake. He's a bright person. I think he's a person of great integrity, and people denigrate Jeff Flake because they say, well, Jeff's speaking out, but he's speaking out because he's not running again because he was going to lose. But I want to tell you something. If Jeff Flake only cared about serving another 6 years, he'd be well on his way to re-election. The reason that he wasn't and isn't is that during the primary, he said that he thought Donald Trump was unfit for office. And there were a great many other Republicans who said exactly the same thing. But when it became clear that nonetheless Donald Trump was going to be the GOP nominee, and all of his colleagues started to fall in line, he refused to fall in line. Now, if all he cared about was being reelected, he would have fallen in line too, and he'd be fine. But there was something more important to him, and I think it was looking his kids in the eye. I think it was his faith. I think it was his love of country. And I'm just astonished at what a rare species he would turn out to be. I think he'll leave the Senate with a lot of respect. I think he'll leave with his head held high, and I think a lot of his colleagues will leave under very different circumstances. But I think it's you know, the political calculus back home. I also think that for many of the Republican members, and certainly McConnell and Ryan, they feel if the president were to crater because they spoke out against him, that they would go down with him. And so they don't. To me, it's the triumph of party and retaining power over country, and it marks a very sad chapter in our history.
My name's Kevin Costa. I'm a politics and economics analyst for Radio France International, the Portuguese language service, Europe, Africa, and Brazil. But I'm not here in that capacity. I'm here as a very proud Brown alumnus. Three numbers came to mind during your talk. The first of which is, you know, someone could lose by 3 million votes and still become president because in a very small handful of states, a very small number of votes can determine the election. Could we defend our democracy by getting rid of an institution that's not democratic? Two, the NRA, tens of thousands of people die. I've heard that Russian money's gone to them. What have you learned, and what remains to be investigated? And third, tens of billions of dollars of Russian fossil fuel money gets laundered in the West. What can we do to stop, for example, Russian fossil fuel money from being laundered in the real estate markets of London, New York, and Miami?
Well, it not only gets laundered, but they use that money to weigh in, ironically, in support of environmental groups and environmental interests, anti-fracking efforts. You know, they're quite strategic about how they use their petrodollars. But we had on our witness list and have on our witness list individuals that we would like to talk to on the issue of whether the Russians were funneling money through the NRA. We also were making every effort we could to determine whether Russian money laundering was an issue vis-a-vis the Trump organization. But as with many other vectors of the investigation, our majority was unwilling to issue any subpoenas whatsoever. So we continue to have the spectacle of people who would come before our committee and answered the questions that they thought were helpful to themselves or the president and refused to answer any others. So you had someone like Steve Bannon come in and say initially, I won't answer any question about what I saw while I was in the administration or during the transition, and I won't answer most of the questions about even after I left the administration. And we asked, are you invoking privilege, executive privilege? Is this some kind of new, breathtaking, never before seen, expansive privilege? No, I'm just doing it because the White House asked me not to. And, you know, interestingly, we've had a number of witnesses do this. I'm here on a voluntary basis, and therefore I can refuse to answer anything I don't want to answer. And we would say to the majority, let's not make it voluntary anymore. Let's give them a subpoena. And they would refuse. In the case of Bannon, they were willing to make an exception because at that point, Bannon was neither beloved in the White House nor at Breitbart. So in a show of great indignation, they actually gave him a subpoena on the spot. And the Democratic members were like, wow, where have you been? To our majority colleagues. But it immediately became apparent that they could not distinguish between why they were being this way with Bannon and not this way with Corey Lewandowski or Hope Hicks or Don Jr. or any other witnesses that came in and simply refused to answer things that they thought were inconvenient. And so we never enforced the subpoena. We never were able to move forward to hold Steve Bannon in contempt. They made a contempt of our proceedings, basically. And so under this majority, there will be no investigation of whether the Russians were laundering money either through the Trump Organization or through the NRA. They're simply not interested. I should point out that it's not that the Republicans on our committee have ended their investigation. They've just ended the ones that really mattered to the country that we were charged to do. They continue to investigate the FBI and the State Department and the Justice Department and Christopher Steele. It's just that anything that might be incriminating of the president, they've decided they don't want to know. And so those questions that you posed, if there are going to be answers to them, they'll have to be answered by Bob Mueller because at least in the House, they're not interested. And in the Senate on the issue of money laundering, they're also not authorized to investigate that. So that is something that we have to hope for the country's sake that Bob Mueller is investigating, because if the Russians were laundering money through the Trump Organization, that is the most compromising of all, in my view. Most people, when they think about what the Russians call compromat, they think of that salacious video. With this president, that's not that compromising. I mean, after Stormy Daniels and, you know, the Playboy Playmate, what's another, you know, whatever. But if the president's organization was engaged in criminal activity and laundering money for the Russians, that would be a powerful lever over the president's head. And we owe it to the country to find out it's true or it's not true and tell the country.
Thank you.
At 5 minutes past 2, we have about another 5 minutes, and then we'll need to share the congressman.
Congressman, welcome to Providence. It's so great to have you here, and I want to say to you from the bottom of my heart, you define what an American patriot is to me in 2018. I mean, you are what a patriot is. Seriously. Thank you. But I'd just like you to muse within 5 minutes, if you could, or whatever, about another topic I have, a threat from within, which is the lack of knowledge that many, many people have about our democratic system. As a political junkie, and I'm sure maybe some of you here as well, as soon as I went crazy about the House Intel Republicans shutting down, do you know how many people said to me, people I love, people that I have respect for, why is that bothering you so much? So many things. The president lying again Friday, grotesquely. Why is that bothering you so much? So the knowledge of some of the most elemental parts of our democracy, a threat within, the lack of participation. What can I do about those Republicans that did not allow you to subpoena when you absolutely should have? What about the people living in their district? Hundreds of thousands of people. They couldn't have agreed with that. So knowledge, participation. Can you give me some of your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, first, let me give you all some good news, because I know if you view the world the way many of us do, it's a particularly distressing time. And I'm continually struck by how many people have been so viscerally affected. I have people coming up to me almost every day, literally in tears, about what's going on. And it can be overwhelming. I mean, you see, we pulled out of the climate accord, and, you know, John Bolton is our national security advisor, God help us. And, you know, the reaction can be, it's just too much. I'm going to just turn off the news. I'm going to stop listening to it because it's just too much. And I wouldn't even know where to begin to do anything about it. But the good news is that millions and millions of people are getting involved to a degree they never have before, all over the country. And this was vividly brought home to me when I was flying back to D.C. a couple weeks ago. A woman sitting next to me introduced herself, and she said, "I'm part of an 11,000 woman strong organization online. We call ourselves Law Mamas. We are lawyers, we are mothers, we are smart, we're determined, and we're not going to put up with this anymore. And we are organized." And there are organizations like that popping up every day. And we see it reflected in what's happening in elections all over the country. And it all brings me back to something Bill Clinton once said. There's nothing wrong in America that can't be cured by what's right in America. There's an awful lot right in America that will see us through this time. We are a strong and a resilient, not only people, but democracy, and we will get through this. But I do think it's a time where we all have a part to play right now. We, in our public office, yes, but in our private life, our civic life, our corporate life. And what I encourage people to do is not try to do it all, which can be completely paralyzing, but just pick one or two things and decide, okay, in this year, I'm going to get involved in this one thing, because we can all make a difference. And there are lots of great ways to do it, and that's what's going to carry us through this. And I apologize my answers are so long. My wife says, your answers are way too long, and she's right. But the more fundamental challenge, I think, implicated in your question, and to me this is the cross-cutting issue of all, the way we get our information now is so radically different from one to another. When I was in college, I went to not as good a school as this. I went to Stanford. Just don't quote me back home on that. I remember rushing home to my dorm to see Walter Cronkite's last broadcast. And that was a time when there was a broad category of objective fact that we agreed on, and we might differ on what to do with that fact, but at least we could agree that certain things were true. And then in the 90s, we moved to a model of cable news where if you were conservative, you watched Fox, and if you were liberal, you watched MSNBC. If you weren't sure, you watched CNN. But now, a majority of Americans, not just young Americans, a majority of Americans get their news on social media. And the way these algorithms function, and Mr. Zuckerberg will be asked about this tomorrow, but the way these algorithms function is their job is to keep you on their platform, to keep your eyes on their platform, because they sell advertising. And that means they want to show you the news that you want to see. Because if I went to my Twitter feed and the news stories below it were all coming from Fox and Breitbart, I wouldn't want to be on my phone very much. And they know that about me. They know what stories I share with other people. They know what things I like. They know what things I don't like. They know what my friends like and don't like. They know where I live. They know how old I am. They know what my ethnicity and my religion is. And they can micro-target information to me so I don't see anything I don't want to see. And this is the bigger challenge. It's not, I think, that Americans lack civics education. I think it's just that they're given two different worldviews now, and sometimes very individualized worldviews. I got off the train station at Penn Station in New York a couple months ago. It was a perfect illustration. I'm like a walking focus group now. People recognize me a lot more than they used to, and so I get an earful. So the first New Yorker comes up to me and says, "Are you Adam Schiff? I just want to shake your hand. You're my hero," which I enjoyed for about a millisecond. Before the next New Yorker came up to me and said, "Well, you're not my hero. Why are you eavesdropping on our conversations and leaking them to the press?" And I thought, oh my God. First of all, I thought, okay, this is what it's like to be a New York member of Congress every day. But I also thought, okay, I know what this guy's watching, and I know what that guy's watching, and it's not the same thing. And that is the far more fundamental problem. Congress isn't going to regulate an algorithm. We're not going to tell Fox News they can't say what they say. If we're smart, we're not going to allow this kind of concentration of media the way Sinclair wants to do. But but that is the far more, I think, fundamental challenge. Can we take one more question from this?
Yes, actually what I'd like us to do is if each person can very briefly ask your question, let's get all the questions on the table and give the congressman then a moment to reply.
Sure,
So very
sure.
briefly.
Yeah. So I was really interested in the notion that you were talking about with regard to America on the world stage, and in that we really are the singular nation to whom other nations, especially those in duress, look to for aid to be this sort of bastion of democracy in an increasingly undemocratic world. But as you said, not so much recently. The great America that fought through the Cold War and that was there during World War II is sort of gone as of late. And perhaps this is my personal opinion, and you can tell me if you agree, but I would argue that it is because of actions by this administration that President Trump has begun to alienate other nations. And I'm wondering what you believe it will take to restore the reputation of America in 2020 and beyond.
And so if we could just go down very quickly, state your question.
Sure, I'll try to be brief. I know we talked about some of the ways
And
people
I'm just going to, because I don't have a pen and pad, I'm going to write these. Oh, can I borrow yours? Yeah. Because I have the Rick Perry rule. Like Rick Perry, I'm not sure I can remember more than 2 things. So, which, by the way, would now qualify me to run a department, even if I couldn't remember which one it was.
That's true. Sure. So I know we talked about some of the ways that media bubbles are sorting people into different media ecosystems, and they're getting information from different places, which is making them more vulnerable to misinformation campaigns. But I also want to talk about another tool that I think the Russians used effectively, which is whataboutism. For every criticism of Donald Trump, the Russians had something else to pull out about Hillary Clinton or the Democrats. And while a lot of it was fake news or trumped up, I think it's fair to say there were some elements of truth in that, and that I don't think either party is perfect or ever really has been, and while I think everything President Trump did may have been worse, the kernels of truth, I think, may have caught on. So what I wanted to ask about is your thoughts on how we can encourage people to look at criticisms of politicians and parties in context, because if not, we could have another situation where lots of people vote for Jill Stein, Gary Johnson, and write-ins, and that takes away votes from a bulwark against an undemocratic candidate.
And very briefly.
I'm hoping that line about the dust heap of history is true. I read Toynbee a few years ago, and now with great dismay I watch his dire predictions sort of unfolding. My question is there some design flaw in the American system that a non-reading ignoramus can come in and pretty much turn this country into Pottersville, the whole deconstruction of the administrative state and all that? I mean, and also I'm the proud mother of someone who worked at the fake news institutions, New York Times and CNN, so thank you.
Here.
Hi, Congressman Schiff. My name's Evan. I'm an undergrad. I'll try to be as brief as possible. I'm the son of a veteran. My dad was in the Navy for 30 years. He retired as a Rear Admiral a couple of years ago. By the time I was 16, my father was deployed for 8 out of the 16 years of my life. So I really know what it means to have, when the U.S. is involved in foreign wars and what it really means for American families. I saw what happened when the U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein in Iraq and how it kind of left a bit of a vacuum in Iraq, and what a lot of people think might have caused the rise of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Iraq. So my question for you is, do you think the U.S. should be continuing to fund rebels in Syria when it's been shown that a lot of these funds that go to rebels end up in weapons and money end up in the hands of organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, and whether or not we should just kind of pull back, bring our money and our people home, and let the Syrians decide for themselves what they want for their country.
Okay, and then finally.
My name is Susan, and I'm a woman, and only 2 women stood up. I don't know if it's because the men were just faster, but I think it's important that women are part of this dialogue. My questions are very brief and factual. Is it possible for Mueller to bring a sealed indictment against the president? And what happens if he does get canned by the president? What happens to the investigation at that point? Thank you.
So, Congressman. we know we need to share you here soon, so we'll just allow you to speak as you would like on those questions, and then we will share you.
Okay, thank you. This is the lightning round. So what can we do to return America's place in the world, restore American standing? You know, I think that when people look at what we're going through right now in other parts of the world, they look at it with some understanding. Certainly the British went through their Brexit and are still going through their Brexit. And I think probably many in Britain feel that whatever virus produced Brexit crossed the pond and got more virulent in the crossing, and now we have Donald Trump. If this is a one-term presidency, I think much of the world views this as an aberration, as a overcorrection to the last president, but one that has then been corrected. If this administration should go on beyond one term, then I think the rest of the world has to conclude that America is not the country that it both used to be and that they thought it was. That would be a terrible tragedy for people to lose confidence in America that way. I go to an annual National Security Conference in Munich where you get a good sense of the feedback of the rest of the world on what's happening here. And this year, John McCain usually leads the delegation. He wasn't well enough to lead it this year. But he led it last year, and I remember one of the nice things about traveling with him is he can invite anyone he wants to dinner, and they will come. And so we had dinner with Bono and Bill Gates. And that's not usually my dining companions. But as the evening went on, we started to tell jokes, and Bono told a joke about being Irish. And then he got very serious, and he said, I love Ireland, I'm very proud of Ireland, but Ireland, like most countries, is just a country. America is also an idea. I think that if this goes on too long, we start to lose that idea of what this country stands for. But I think another president, the next president, can do a lot to restore our place in the world and to burnish that idea again. Now, it won't be overnight, and the rest of the world isn't standing still while we go through whatever we're going through. China, continues on its ascendant path. So we're not going to easily recover lost ground, but I think we can recover our moral standing in the world and our place among the nations. You're absolutely right. The question about the whataboutism, and the Russians are quite good at this. I don't know how many of you ever watched RT. Some of you may watch RT not knowing it was RT. It used to be Russia Today, but that had too much Russia in it, so they go by RT now. They have a huge presence on YouTube and get hundreds of millions of views on YouTube, so a lot of Americans actually end up seeing RT. But one of the things that RT does really well is they will always find some useful idiot to go on and make these whataboutism arguments with no context, or they'll take comments that someone makes completely out of context, so, I remember on RT they had a professor somewhere from some university saying that it was ludicrous to claim, I think this was in connection with one of the other chemical weapons attacks, that was worse than the war in Iraq, which had killed hundreds of thousands of people. Now, no one ever said that one attack was worse, but they can always find somebody to make these completely red herring arguments. And the most you can do is point out the absurdity when they do it, do very quick and diligent fact-checking, but also, as the doctor's question earlier alluded, recognize where we have fallen short, and there are times where we have fallen dramatically short. I've been part of a commission in the Congress for years. I'm no longer part because the membership rotates, but called the Democracy Assistance Commission, where we will meet with the parliaments in emerging democracies. And we would always make the case, when you win an election, you don't seek to jail the losing party. Well, I don't know that we can make that argument anymore. Or if we can, we have to say, do what we say, not what we do. But you're right, this is a challenge, and it's a bigger challenge now, I think, than ever. Is there some fundamental flaw in our system that has produced this result? Well, you know, I don't know that I would say there's a fundamental flaw in the sense of there being a single root cause of how we got to where we are. There are any number of things that have contributed to where we are. And certainly the way we finance our campaigns now has a lot to do with it. It's a problem that goes well back before Citizens United, I think, to a case called Buckley versus Vallejo. In Buckley, the Supreme Court found that, you might recall this, holding that money is speech. And therefore, because the ability to amplify your message is inherent in being able to have a message, you equate money with speech, and you can only regulate speech if you have a compelling state interest. And this came up in the context of two post-Watergate reforms, one that struck down a limit on contributions and one that struck down a limit on expenditures, independent expenditures. And the Supreme Court in Buckley said, because money is speech and you need a compelling state interest, we're going to strike down, well, we're going to hold the limit on contributions to a candidate because that could corrupt the candidate. And we have a compelling state interest in not having corrupt elected officials. But we're going to strike down the limit on independent expenditures because they're independent and couldn't possibly corrupt. Well, you know, that has lent itself to a system in which a single donor like Sheldon Adelson can only give $5,400 to Donald Trump, but can spend $54 million on behalf of Donald Trump airing the same commercials, essentially. That makes no sense whatsoever. And obviously, not just Sheldon Adelson. Whether you're on the right or the left, it's the same problem. So how we finance campaigns has contributed to this. Gerrymandering has contributed to this. The way we get our information has contributed to this. And what it has all produced is a highly polarized electorate. Now, I think there were a unique set of circumstances that produced Donald Trump, in which you had this cast of a thousands Republican primary. And then you also had the situation where people were hungry for change. And all the candidates but two looked the same. They all looked like status quo candidates, except for Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And when Bernie Sanders was no longer a candidate in the general election, then there was a significant enough number of people who wanted something different than the status quo that they were ready to completely roll the dice. Now that the Republican Party could produce Donald Trump is a major indictment of the Republican Party. That the Democratic Party could lose to Donald Trump is a major indictment of the Democratic Party. But I don't think you can point to only one thing needing correction. There are many things needing correction. It took us a long time to dig this hole. It will take a long time to get out, but what I do think and what does give me optimism is we're seeing people all around the country who are determined to turn this country around and change its direction and mitigate the harm that's been done until we're in a position where we can restore our place both at home and abroad again. Should we be funding the rebels in Syria? First of all, thank you for your father's service, and to the gentleman in the service that asked a question about cyber, thank you for your service. I just got back from Afghanistan visiting our service members there, and seeing both how wonderful they are, but also how easy it is to get into a conflict and how hard it is to get out. We're still there after 17 years. Are we still going to be in Syria after 17 years? Are we going to still be in Iraq after 17 years? The president, in addition to announcing that he was going to be withdrawing our people, also either suspended or terminated $200 million in support for the Syrian Arab coalition, basically these Kurdish and Arabic allies of ours in the region. I think that's a terrible mistake. And, you know, we have to be careful. Certainly, it's very difficult to vet people. There's no guarantee when you support people that their support doesn't end up in the wrong hands. And during the Syrian war, support we gave our allies in Syria did end up, some of it, in the wrong hands. But I think it's a bigger mistake to abandon the people that were fighting and dying next to us as we were working to defeat this scourge that was ISIS. So certain types of aid, I think we should continue to give. And I think we ought to continue to help those Syrians maintain a safe place where they're not at risk either from the regime or the Russians or Turkey at this point. While I hope that it doesn't turn into that kind of indefinite commitment, I think given what happened in Iraq when we withdrew our forces precipitously, I would not want to see that happen again and a resurgence of ISIS. And then finally, to the woman who asked the question about the sealed indictment and what happens if the investigation of Mueller is fired, let me just say also, apropos of your being one of two women asking the questions today, that one of the great changes that we have seen wrought in the last year is there are more women running for office than ever before. And I think what typified that in a very powerful fashion was the cover of Time magazine a couple months ago, which showed dozens of women on its cover with a caption that said, "First we marched, now we run." And they're some of the most phenomenal candidates I've ever seen, and they will be a big part of the change that comes to the country, I'm confident, in November. In terms of, is it possible that Mueller could return a sealed indictment? It's possible. I think it's unlikely that Mueller would indict a sitting president. In my view, there's no constitutional prohibition on indicting a president known as above the law. But I think there are prudential reasons why, if Mueller believes that the level of evidence rises to proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that he's more likely to present it to Congress for the purposes of a potential impeachment than go to a grand jury and ask for an indictment against the president. I say that because I don't think that Mueller is going to want the fate of the country decided by 12 lay jurors in a particular courthouse. And also there's a deep divide legally and constitutionally about whether that's possible, and while I feel it is, it would be a deeply divisive issue for the country, whether that was legitimate or illegitimate. So I think he's unlikely to go that route. Now, if he did, the court might very well stay any prosecution until after the presidency. I think the other question is the one we may have more likelihood of dealing with, and that is, what if he's fired? What happens to the investigation then? Now, in theory, Mueller just works for the Justice Department, and if one lawyer is fired from the Justice Department, then another would take over. So you might not have a special counsel appointed, although in theory you could have that, another special counsel to take his place. You could also, though, have a Department of Justice lawyer take charge of that investigation. Now, that would obviously be of great concern. The whole point of appointing a special counsel was to give them the requisite independence and make sure their work was not interfered with. And now with this White House, with its history of interfering in the Justice Department, the public wouldn't have much confidence in one of the department lawyers taking on that responsibility. One of the things that I would like to see Congress do is pass a law that says that if Mueller were fired, all of his investigative files would be provided to the Congress. Now that, I think, would be a significant deterrent to firing Bob Mueller. And I say that because it's important to realize that Bob Mueller may not be able to speak outside of the four corners of an indictment. Bob Mueller is not likely to make a report to the American people of everything he found. He'll report to Rod Rosenstein, but whether that report will ever be shared with Congress, we don't know. It's very unclear. And if there are things that Bob Mueller finds that are clear and convincing proof on collusion or obstruction of justice or on money laundering or anything else, but they don't rise to proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the country still ought to know about it. But the president sure as heck isn't going to want the country to know about it, which is why requiring that if he were fired, all that information be provided to Congress would be a powerful deterrent. It still may not be deterrent enough, but I think it would be a powerful deterrent. It would also, I think, be powerful to have a provision that provides that Mueller cannot be fired except for cause. So those are some legislative changes that I'd like to see. If he were fired, what I would advocate is that Congress reauthorize an office we used to have, that of independent counsel. Make that statute narrowly tailored to the Russia investigation and allow for Mueller's reappointment to that position such that he would be beyond the reach of the president. Whether any of those things would happen, though, who can say? Because the people who should be speaking out now, frankly, we should pass these things prospectively, are not willing to do so. But that is what I'd like to see happen. That's what we should fight for if that time came. And once again, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.